The kitchen is hers. That's what she's for. My mother-in-law said that about my wife. She said it at a dinner table in front of 11 relatives, with a little laugh at the end so nobody could call it cruelty. And every year, when Christmas came around, I watched those words turn into a schedule. My wife cooking alone in a house full of people, her sister-in-law resting, her brother refilling his glass, and Ruth at the stove, doing what Delia had decided she was for. I let it happen for years. I want to be honest about that before I tell you anything else. I sat in that dining room and I said nothing, and I told myself silence was patience. This past Christmas, the 2 chairs meant for us at the head table sat empty, and nobody knew why until it was far too late to fix. My name is Walter Cade. I'm 68 years old and I live in Asheville, North Carolina, up where the roads bend and the winters bite. For 31 years I flew commercial aircraft. Captain, left seat, the person the whole cabin trusts without ever seeing his face. And if you fly long enough, you learn one thing that most people never think about. A plane loaded past its limits still looks perfectly level on the ground. It sits there calm, the wings even, the nose steady, and you would swear nothing is wrong. The trouble only shows up in the air, when you ask it to climb, and it simply cannot. That was my marriage in-laws for a long time. Level on the ground, fine at the table. Wrong the second you ask them to lift anything. Ruth is 65. We've been married for 39 years. She is the quiet one in any room, the one who remembers your children's names and your surgery date, and which cookie you don't like. Her family, the Fosters, took all of that and filed it under one word, useful, and the head of the family, the person everyone bends toward, is Delia. Ruth's mother, a woman who has never once cooked a Christmas dinner in her life but has hosted every single one. If this is your first time here, take a second to hit like and subscribe, and drop your city and the time where you are down in the comments. I read every single one, and I'd like to know who's out there listening tonight. It matters to me more than you'd think. Now let me tell you how small it starts. Because it never starts with the big thing, it starts with a chair. The first Christmas I really noticed, Ruth and I drove down from Asheville, a car full of dillis she'd made the night before. 20-some people in Delia's house, the table set with the good runner and folded napkins, and when everyone sat, there was no seat for Ruth. Not by accident. There simply wasn't one placed. She'd been cooking since morning, and when the food finally went out, her own mother looked around and said, "Oh, Ruth doesn't mind eating in the kitchen. She likes it back there." Ruth smiled and said she did like it back there. She carried her plate to the counter and ate standing up while her brother told a story about golf. I remember gripping a fork and counting my breathing, the way you do in the cockpit when a warning light comes on, and the worst thing you can do is react fast. In flying, they teach you that panic kills more people than the emergency does. So I stayed level. I told myself, one dinner. It was not one dinner. The next year, it was the tea. And she wanted the good iced tea, and she's the good iced tea, the kind Ruth makes with mint from her own garden. She didn't ask flat halfway toward the kitchen and said, loud, flat, no question mark anywhere in it. Ruth, tea. Now, not in an hour. Like ordering from a menu. The church couple laughed nervously and looked at their plates. Ruth got up and made the tea. I watched a woman I'd loved for nearly 4 decades bring a pitcher to a table she wasn't allowed to sit at, and pour for people who wouldn't remember her name by New Year's. She poured for everyone and then she went back to the stove. Not angry, not yet, just very still. The next one cut deeper. That same year, Ruth had spent weeks knitting Delia a scarf. Soft gray wool, a pattern Ruth's own grandmother taught her, the kind of thing you cannot buy at any price because the hours in it aren't for sale. She wrapped it. She gave it, and Delia held it up in front of the room, turned it over once, and set it down on the side table. "That's not really our taste," she said, and she meant our, as if they'd taken a vote. In February, Ruth found the scarf, still with the tag she'd tied on it, sitting in a bag of things Delia was donating to the church rummage sale. Ruth didn't cry. She just brought it home and put it in a drawer and never mentioned it again. "I mentioned it, once," Ruth said. "It's just how she is, Walter. Don't make it a..." So, I didn't make it a thing. That was my job in that family, apparently, to not make it a thing. You start to see the pattern the way a pilot reads weather. Not one storm, a front. A whole system moving in a direction, and everything under it getting colder, no seat. Barked orders, a handmade gift treated like garbage. And the whole time, Delia at the center, calm and pleasant and level on the ground, running a household where her daughter was the help and her son-in-law was the wallet. Now that last part, the wallet, is something I've never told anyone. Not my kids, not my closest friend, and certainly not the Fosters. But you should know it, because it's the weight nobody at that table could see, and it's the reason this story ends the way it does. For 6 years, I have been paying, without a word, the Fosters' bills. It started with a phone call from Ruth's brother. Back when their father was still alive, and the medical costs came in like a tide nobody planned for. The heating bill on that big drafty house had gone unpaid 2 months running. Then the property tax note on the family home came due with a shortfall they couldn't cover, and the county doesn't send scarves to the rummage sale, it sends a lien. Ruth was up at night about it. Her family, for all its cruelty at the dinner table, was still her family, and she couldn't sleep knowing the house she grew up in might go. So I set up a transfer, quietly. Every month an amount that covered the heating shortfall, and once a year, a larger one timed to the property tax. I did it through my own account, routed so it never showed a name, because I knew that if Delia ever found out the money came from me, she would rather freeze than admit it. Pride like hers doesn't take help, it takes tribute. 6 years. Nobody ever asked where the money came from. Nobody ever wondered why the lien never landed, why the furnace kept running through those mountain winters, why a family with no real income never went cold. They assumed. Maybe they thought the county forgave it. Maybe they thought Delia was cleverer with money than she was. What they never once considered was that the man eating alone at the counter, the man whose wife wasn't good enough for a chair, was the reason the lights stayed on over their heads. You want to know what that does to a person year after year? Paying for the warmth of a house where your wife isn't welcome to sit? I used to fly people who had no idea how close a thing had been. They'd walk off the jet bridge complaining about the peanuts, never knowing the crosswind on final was right at the edge of what the aircraft could take. I got good at carrying things without complaint, maybe too good. Because carrying a thing without complaint is not the same as fixing it, and I let myself confuse the two for a very long time. Ruth knew about the money, of course. She's my wife, but even she didn't know the full size of it, and she never asked, because asking would have made it real, and if it was real, then she'd have to feel something about the fact that her own mother was being kept afloat by the man her mother treated like a checkbook. We don't talk about it. We just paid it. Every month, like clockwork, like a flight schedule. Silent. And on time and completely unappreciated. People ask me, when I let a little of this slip, why I never said anything, why a grown man, a captain, someone who commanded a crew in a cabin and made life or death calls for a living, would sit at a table and take it. And the honest answer is complicated. Part of it was Ruth asking me not to. Part of it was 30 years of training that teaches you never to make a sudden move at the wrong moment. And part of it, the part I'm least proud of, is that I didn't have a plan yet. Reacting is easy. Anyone can flip a table. But a table flipped in December is forgotten by January, and Delia would have simply rewritten the story so that I was the unstable one, the difficult son-in-law, and Ruth would have paid for it all year long. So I waited. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. Looking back, I think I was really waiting to understand what the right kind of leaving looked like. There's a term we use in aviation. The point of no return. It's the moment in a flight where you no longer have enough fuel to turn back to where you started. From that point on, the only way is forward. Every year at that table, I felt myself getting closer to it, and every year I told myself, not yet. The thing about weight and balance, though, the thing they drill into you until it's in your bones, is that it isn't about how much you're carrying. It's about where the weight sits. A load in the wrong place will pitch you nose down no matter how strong the engines are. And for 6 years, the weight in that family sat entirely on Ruth, and on me, and Delia had arranged the whole thing so smoothly that from the outside it looked balanced, it looked like a family, it looked level on the ground. I want to be clear about something because I've thought about it a great deal. I don't tell you all this so you'll think I'm a good man for paying, or a coward for staying quiet. Both of those are true, and neither of them is the point. The point is that a person can be exploited slowly in increments so small that no single one of them is worth a fight. A missing chair, a barked order, a gift in a donation bag, a bill you cover in the dark. None of it is the crime. All of it, together, is. Ruth turned 65 that year. 65 years old, and her mother still spoke to her the way you'd speak to a hired girl. I'd sit in that house watching my wife's hands, the hands that had knitted that scarf, the hands that had made 39 years of dinners, and I'd think about how those hands were always moving and everyone else's were always empty. And Delia at the head of the table, presiding over a warmth she didn't pay for, in a house she didn't keep, served by a daughter she'd decided was for the kitchen. Something in me had already made a decision by then. I just hadn't told myself yet. You know how you can be certain of a thing before you have the words for it? That was me, that autumn, driving home through the mountains after another dinner where Ruth ate standing up. I remember the road, and the cold coming down off the ridge, and the strange calm I felt. Not the calm of peace, the calm of a pilot who has finished the checklist and is only waiting for clearance. Because what I hadn't told Ruth, what I hadn't told anyone, was that I'd started to do the math. The real math. Not the math of grocery lists and holiday seating, the math of a manifest. Who is truly carrying this aircraft, and who is a passenger who never bought a ticket. And once you run those numbers honestly, you cannot unsee them. Delia thought she was the one who decided things. She thought the kitchen was Ruth's, and the money was endless, and the chairs would always be full of people who took what she gave and asked no questions. She had no idea that the quiet man at the counter had been running the weight and violence the whole time, and that the numbers had finally stopped adding up. She was about to make one more decision. The biggest one. She was going to tell my wife exactly what she was for, in exact terms, list and an exact number of guests. And she was going to say it in a way that left no room to pretend it was anything but what it was. And that was the moment the whole thing tipped. The decision came in the middle of November, on a Tuesday, over the phone, and it wasn't really a request. Delia rarely requested anything. She announced, and the rest of us adjusted our lives around the announcement the way a runway crew clears a taxiway when the tower says a jet is coming through. Ruth was standing at the kitchen window when she took the call, and I was at the table with a cup of coffee going cold, and I watched my wife's shoulders come up around her ears the way they do when she's bracing. "Yes, Mom. Yes, I understand." That was most of it. "Yes, Mom. I understand." Ruth doesn't argue with her mother. She never learned how, because she was never allowed to practice. She hung up and stood there for a moment with her hand still on the phone, and then she turned around and gave me the manifest. That's the word I use for it now, though at the time she just called it the plan. Christmas dinner, 22 guests, 14 dishes, cooked by Ruth alone. I asked her to say it again, because I wanted to be sure I'd heard the whole load before I did anything with it. 22 people, she said, counting Delia's church friends, the cousins driving in from Charlotte. 14 dishes, because Delia had decided a proper Christmas needed the 2 roasts, and the ham and the sides and the 2 pies, and the third that was Delia's own tradition, even though Delia had never once made it. A 5 a.m. start on the 24th, because Delia always held the family's Christmas on the eve, and the roasts take all day, and she liked to have the house smelling right by the time her guests arrived. Delia's china only, the good set, the one Ruth had to hand wash after because it couldn't go in the machine, and a grocery list, itemized in Delia's handwriting, that came to right around $400, which Ruth would pay for, herself. I want you to sit with that number for a second, because it's the one that finally did it for me, not the 14 dishes, and not the 22 guests. It was the $400. Ruth was going to buy the food, with our money, and cook it, with her own 2 hands, for people who would not save her a chair, in a house whose heating I had been paying, without a word, for 6 years. The daughter buys the grocery and cooks the feast. The son-in-law keeps the furnace lit, and Delia sits at the head of a table she pays for with nothing but the assumption that she is owed it. I asked Ruth if she'd told Delia it was too much. She looked at me like I'd asked whether she'd told the mountain to move. "You know how she is, Walter," she said, and then, quieter, the thing she always says. "Don't make it a thing." But it already was a thing. It had been a thing for 6 years. The only person who hadn't admitted it out loud was me. Delia said something that week, and it's the sentence the whole story hangs on. I've turned it over so many times I could recite it in my sleep. A week or so after the phone call, Ruth's sister-in-law was over at Delia's for coffee, and she made the mistake of saying, kindly, that maybe the family could split some of the cooking this year, that Ruth had looked tired last Christmas. And Delia, without looking up from her cup, said the thing. "The kitchen is hers. That's what she's for. That's what she's for. Not what she does, not what she's good at, what she's for. Like a tool has a purpose, like a part on an aircraft has a function stamped on it in the maintenance log. My wife, 65 years old, 39 years my partner, the woman who remembers everyone's surgery dates, reduced to a purpose by the person who was supposed to love her first and longest." The sister-in-law told Ruth she'd said it, thinking it was almost funny, thinking Ruth would shrug it off the way she shrugs off everything. Ruth told me that night, in bed, in the dark, in a flat little voice, the way you'd read off a weather report. I didn't say anything for a while. I lay there and I did what I always do when the situation is bad and getting worse. I ran the numbers. Because that's the thing about being a captain that never leaves you. You can be furious inside, you can have every alarm in your body going off, and your hands stay steady and your voice stays even because somebody has to fly the airplane. And what I was doing, lying in that dark bedroom, was flying the airplane. I was looking at the manifest, not the grocery manifest. The real one. Who is carrying this aircraft, and who is a passenger who never bought a ticket? Let me put it the way I'd put it to a first officer. You have an airplane. It has a maximum weight it can carry, and every pound of that weight has to earn its place. Fuel earns its place, it gets you home. Cargo earns its place, somebody paid to ship it. Passengers earn their place, they bought a seat. And then sometimes you find a load nobody logged. Weight that got on board without a ticket, without a manifest entry, without anyone signing for it, and it's been riding along for years, and the airplane has been flying nose heavy the whole time. And everyone just assumed that was normal, because it always looked level on the ground. Delia was the load nobody logged. 22 guests, and she was the only one who never carried a thing. I lay there and I built the picture the way you build a weight and balance sheet before a flight. On one side, the 5 a.m. start, the $400, 39 years of her hands always moving. On the other side, me. The heating shortfall, month after month, routed so it wouldn't show a name. The property tax note every year, 6 years of it. And in the middle at the balance point, exactly where the weight tips an airplane one way or the other, sat Delia, presiding, deciding, costing everyone and paying nothing. And I understood something I hadn't let myself understand before. The reason nobody could feel how nose-heavy that family flew was that Ruth and I had spent 6 years compensating. Trimming. In flying, trim is what holds the airplane steady against a load that's out of place. You wind in a little pressure to counteract the imbalance, and the airplane flies level, and the passengers never feel a thing, and they think the pilot is a genius or they think about nothing at all, because there's nothing to notice. Ruth was the trim on Delia's Christmas. I was the trim on Delia's house, and as long as we held that pressure, the whole crooked thing looked perfectly balanced. But trim is a fix, not a solution. You hold it because you have to, until you don't have to anymore. And the second you release it, the airplane does exactly what it was always going to do. It shows you where the weight really was. I did 2 things after that night. I'm not going to tell you what they were yet, because the order matters and the timing matters even more, and if I hand it to you now it won't land the way it landed on them. What I'll tell you is that I did them both in silence, the way I've done everything in that family for 6 years. No announcement, no table flipped. Delia would never have seen a table flipped as anything but proof that I was the problem. She'd have spent a year telling the cousins in Charlotte that Ruth's husband had a temper, and Ruth would have paid the interest on that story every single day. So I stayed level. I filled out the paperwork, so to speak, and I said nothing. Let me give you the countdown, because that's how it felt living it. 3 weeks before Christmas, the grocery list arrived, $400 in Delia's handwriting, and Ruth started clipping coupons for a feast she'd eat standing up. 2 weeks before, Delia called to say she'd added 2 more guests, so make it 24. And Ruth said, "Yes, Mom, I understand," and added 2 more place settings to a table with no chair for her. 8 days before, the china came out of the cabinet, and Ruth washed all of it by hand, ahead of time, because Delia liked it gleaming. I watched my wife dry each plate and stack it, plate after plate, for people who wouldn't remember her name, and I felt that strange cockpit calm settle over me all the way down to my feet. 6 days before, Ruth made her cooking schedule. She writes them out, my wife. A little chart, hour by hour, the roasts and the sides timed so everything comes out hot at once. It's a beautiful piece of planning, honestly. It's the kind of logistics a flight dispatcher would respect. She taped it to the inside of a cut door where only she would see it, and she stood back and looked at it, this monument to her own unpaid labor, and she said, "It'll be fine, Walter. It always is." That was the hardest part. Not Delia's cruelty. Ruth's acceptance. My wife had been trained so completely to be what her mother said she was, for that she'd stopped being able to imagine anything else. She wasn't sad about it. She was efficient about it. And there's nothing that breaks your heart quite like watching someone you love be efficient about their own diminishment. The morning of the 23rd, the day before it all was supposed to happen, I found Ruth in the kitchen at 6 a.m., already prepping the make-ahead dishes, already moving. The stove was on. A pot was going, and the house was very quiet, that particular quiet of a person working alone before the sun is up, doing a job nobody thanked them for and nobody would. I stood in the doorway and I watched her for a minute. 65 years old, 39 of them mine, and her hands were never still. And I thought about the point of no return. In every flight there's a moment, calculated in advance, where you no longer have the fuel to turn back to where you started. Before that point, you can always go home. After it, the only direction is forward, and you commit, and you fly the airplane you've got to the destination you chose. Pilots don't dread that point. We plan for it. We know exactly where it is before we ever leave the ground, and when we cross it, we don't feel fear. We feel clarity. The decision is already made. All that's left is to execute it cleanly. Standing in that doorway, watching Ruth's hands move in the dark, I crossed mine. Now, Before I tell you what I did next, and what happened when 2 chairs at Delia's table stayed empty on Christmas Eve, let me say this plainly, the way I'd say it to anyone sitting across from me. If a story like this one is landing for you tonight, there are a lot more of them on this channel, and I'd take it as a kindness if you stayed a while. Stick around. The next part is the part I've waited 6 years to tell. Because what I'd worked out in the dark, over those weeks, was not revenge in the way people mean the word. I hadn't planned to hurt anyone. I'd planned to stop holding pressure I never should have been holding. Those are different things, though they can look identical from the outside, and I suspect that difference is the whole point of everything I'm telling you. Delia thought she'd made the final decision. 24 guests, 14 dishes, 1 daughter in the kitchen where she belonged, 1 son-in-law good for a quiet check and a quieter seat at the counter. She'd set the whole thing in motion, the china gleaming, the roasts thawing, the manifest complete in her own handwriting, and in her mind it was done, locked in, the way it always was, the way it always would be. What she didn't know was that a weight and balance sheet had been run on her entire arrangement, and the numbers had come back out of limits, and the captain had already made 2 very quiet entries in a logbook nobody else could read. She didn't know that the man at the counter had spent 31 years learning exactly how to release trim, without anyone feeling the airplane move until it had already moved. She thought the seats at her table would always be full. She had no idea that 2 of them were about to be empty, and that the furnace keeping her guests warm through a mountain winter was about to go quiet, and that both of those things had already been set in motion by a man she'd decided was worth nothing but his silence. The trim was wound all the way in, 6 years of it, and on the morning of December 24th, at exactly the moment she'd been counting on us most, I was going to let it go. The 2 things I did in the dark, the 2 quiet entries in a logbook nobody else could read, were these. I booked 2 seats on a morning flight out of Asheville for the 24th of December, 1 for me and 1 for Ruth, to a small place near the water where it does not snow and nobody there had ever heard the name Foster, and I logged into the account I'd used for 6 years, the one routed so it never showed a name, and I set the standing transfers to stop. Not on Christmas. That would have been theater, and theater was Delia's language, not mine. I set them to stop the way they'd started, quietly, on a schedule. The heating payment and the property tax note both wound down to nothing, effective the day we left the ground. That was all of it. That was the entire revenge, if you even want to call it that. I didn't touch a thing in her house. I didn't unplug a furnace or cancel her power or do a single act a man could be arrested for or even ashamed of. I stopped paying for a warmth that was never mine to owe. And I bought 2 tickets so that the woman who'd decided my wife was for the kitchen would find that kitchen, on the biggest morning of her year, with nobody in it. I want to walk you through the day itself, because I've replayed it more times than I can count, and it did not go the way you might expect. There was no shouting. There never is with me. There was just a morning and a drive and an airplane. I told Ruth the night of the 23rd. She was at the stove, prepping for the 5 a.m. start, her chart taped inside the cupboard door, her hands already moving. I turned off the burner. I remember the little click of it, and how loud the quiet was after. She looked at me like I'd made a mistake, like the roast would be late now, and I took the wooden spoon out of her hand and set it down. "We're not going," I said. She didn't understand at first. 39 years, and I'd never once said we're not going to her family. I told her the rest of it slowly, the way you brief a nervous passenger, in order, leaving nothing out. The 2 seats on the morning flight, the little place near the water, and then the part she'd never fully known, the size of it, the 6 years, the transfers. And that they'd already stopped. That the furnace her mother's guests would sit around had been mine to keep lit, and without a word I had set it down. Ruth sat at the kitchen table. She didn't cry and she didn't argue. She looked at the chart taped inside the cupboard, the beautiful logistics of her own unpaid labor, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she said the thing I'll carry to the end of my life. She said, "What will I do if I'm not cooking?" 65 years old, and she had to ask what she was if she wasn't being used. That was the moment I knew I'd read the weight and balance right. That was the moment the whole thing stopped being about Delia at all. We flew out at 9 the next morning. I have taken off from that airport 1,000 times in the left seat, and I had never once been a passenger there until that day. I looked out the little oval window as the mountains dropped away under us. All that cold country where the roads bend, and I felt the airplane climb the way it's supposed to when the weight is finally where it belongs. Level, willing, nose coming up without a fight. Ruth held my hand the whole climb, and somewhere over the ridgeline she started to laugh, very softly, into the collar of her coat, and I understood it wasn't a happy laugh, and it wasn't a sad one. It was the sound a person makes when they set down something they've carried so long they'd forgotten it had weight. Now here is what happened back in Asheville, because I heard about it later, in pieces, the way you always do. Delia woke at 5 on the 24th, expecting the smell of roasts in the house. There was nothing. She called Ruth. No answer. Because Ruth's phone was in a bag in an overhead bin at 30,000 feet. She called again and again. By the time the church and the cousins from Charlotte started arriving that afternoon, 24 guests dressed for a feast, there were 2 empty chairs at the head table and no food on it, 14 dishes, and not one of them cooked. The china stayed in the cabinet, gleaming, hand-washed, and useless. I've thought a lot about that scene. Delia standing in a kitchen she had never once cooked in front of a room full of people she'd invited to admire her, with no daughter to do the thing she was for. She didn't know how. That was the part nobody had ever noticed under all those years of trim. Delia couldn't run her own Christmas because she'd never had to. The whole level, pleasant, well-hosted surface of that family had been Ruth's hands and my quiet checks, and the second both were gone, the airplane did exactly what it had always been going to do. It showed everyone where the weight really was. They ordered pizza, in the end. 24 people in their Christmas best, eating delivery off Delia's good china because she was too proud to admit she had nothing else to serve. I didn't arrange that, and I didn't have to. That's the thing about releasing trim. You don't push the airplane down, you just stop holding it up and gravity does the rest, and gravity was never on Delia's side. It only looked that way because 2 people had been fighting it for 6 years. The furnace part took longer, and it landed harder, and it landed entirely on its own. The heating account went unpaid in January, the way any account goes unpaid when the person paying it stops. The company sent a notice. Then a second one. Ruth's brother, the one who'd made that first phone call 6 years ago, called Ruth in a panic in the middle of a cold snap, because the house was going cold and nobody could figure out why, because as far as any of them knew, the heat had simply always worked. He assumed a billing error. He assumed the county. He assumed anything except the truth, which was that the truth had never occurred to a single one of them. Ruth told him. Quietly, on the phone, no drama in it, the way we do everything. She told him that Walter had been covering the heating shortfall for 6 years, and the property tax note every year routed, so it wouldn't show a name, and that Walter had stopped, and there was a long silence on that line, the kind of silence a man makes when the floor of his understanding drops out from under him. Because now they had to do the math, the real math, the manifest, who had been carrying that house all this time, and when they ran the numbers, they came back to the man at the counter. The son-in-law whose wife wasn't good enough for a chair, the wallet, the quiet check. The person Delia had decided was worth nothing, but his silence had been the reason the lights stayed on and the pipes never froze, and the lien never landed, for 6 winters without a word. Delia found out last. Of course she did. Her pride had built a whole world in which she needed nothing from anyone, and the fact that had held that world up was the one fact she could never be told to her face. When she finally understood it, that the warmth of her house, the roof over her Christmas, the standing of the family home she presided over, had all been paid for by the daughter she'd called useful and the son-in-law she'd called nothing. She didn't call me. She called Ruth, and she didn't apologize. Because apologizing was never something in her. But something in the arrangement had broken that she could not fix with an announcement. Because, for the first time in her life, there was nobody left to adjust their life around her. Here is the part I most want you to hear, and I want to say it plainly, because it's the whole reason I've told you any of this. What we did was not about the money. I need you to understand that. I am not a poor man, and I did not stop those transfers to save $300 a month, and I certainly didn't do it to watch anyone go cold. If it had been only about the money, I'd have kept paying it forever, gladly, for Ruth's sake. And it was never about revenge either, not in the way people mean that word, the getting even, the settling of a score. If getting even was what I wanted, I had 6 years and 100 chances, and I never took one. What it was about was a much simpler and much harder thing. It was about a woman being told, year after year, in words and in schedules and in missing chairs, exactly what she was for. And it was about the fact that a person is not for anything. My wife is not a tool with a function stamped in a maintenance log. She is not the kitchen. She is not free labor with a face. And refusing to be treated that way, calmly declining to keep holding up an arrangement built entirely on your own diminishment, is not abandonment, and it is not cruelty, it is dignity. It's the plainest kind there is. Delia thought that if Ruth stopped serving, Ruth had failed her family, but you cannot in a post that was never a post, only an exploitation. A boundary is not an attack. All a boundary does is put the weight back where it belongs, on the people who were always supposed to carry it and had simply arranged for someone else to. When you stop subsidizing the people who took you for granted, the cost that lands on them was always their cost. You were only hiding it for them, and they will call it cruelty. Because it's much easier to be angry at the person who set the load down than to admit you were never carrying your share of it. That's the lesson, if there is one, and I'm wary of lessons, so take it for what it's worth, from an old pilot who was slow to learn it himself. The quietest revenge in the world is simply to stop holding the trim, to stop making the crooked thing look level. You don't have to hurt anyone, you just have to decline calmly to keep hurting yourself on their behalf. And then you let the numbers do what numbers do. Ruth is different now. That's the part that matters more to me than anything that happened to Delia. She cooked Christmas dinner this year, the one just passed, in our own kitchen, in the little place near the water where we've decided to stay through the winters now. She cooked for two, me and her. She took all day about it because she loves to, and she used the good spoon, and halfway through she stopped and looked at me and said, "There's nobody coming, Walter," and she smiled when she said it. Not a sad smile. It was the first free one I'd seen on her in 39 years. Nobody coming, nobody to serve, just a woman cooking a meal because she wanted to, for a person who saved her a chair. The airplane is level now. I keep coming back to that because it's the only way I know how to say it. For 6 years I held pressure against a load that was never mine, and I told myself that was strength, that carrying a thing without complaint made me a good man. It didn't. It just made me tired, and it kept the crooked thing flying, and it taught Delia that the weight would always be carried no matter where she put it. The strong thing, the thing I should have done years earlier, was not to carry more. It was to stop, and to let the aircraft finally tell the truth about how it was loaded. We're at peace, Ruth and I, not triumphant. I don't feel like I won anything because there was never a game, only a long imbalance that I finally stopped correcting. What I feel is lighter. What I feel is level. There's a warmth in a house you're welcome in, and it's a different kind of warmth than the kind you pay for in the dark and aren't invited to sit near. I know both kinds now. I recommend the first one. So let me ask you something before I go, and I mean it as a real question, not a way to end a story. Is there a place in your life where you've been holding the trim? Some arrangement that only looks level because you keep winding, unthanked, in pressure nobody thanks you for. If there is, I'd like to hear about it. Tell me down in the comments, and tell me what it would take for you to set it down. I read everyone, and I think about them more than you'd guess. There are a lot more stories like this one on the channel, so stay a while if this is the kind of thing that keeps you up thinking. I'd be glad to have you. There's one more thing, and then I'll let you go. When I finally turned my phone back on, the night we landed near the water, there was a voicemail waiting, from Delia. Left at some point on Christmas Eve, when the chairs were empty and the china was clean and the guests were still arriving. 31 seconds long. I saw her name on the screen and I felt Ruth watching me from across the little rented room, and I sat there with my thumb over the button for a good while. I never played it. I still haven't. It's on the phone in my pocket right now. 31 seconds of whatever she finally had to say to the man she'd decided was worth nothing but his silence. Maybe it's an apology. Maybe it's not, and the strange thing, the thing I didn't expect after 6 years of waiting, is that I found I truly did not need to know. Some weight you set down, and some weight you just never pick up in the first place.